Thank you, Tim. Good morning, Minister, colleagues. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide a bit of a retrospective, I guess, over more than 10 years in terms of New Zealand's role in driving this thing we call GRA all the time, Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. What I want to try to do here is sort of step back to the world in 2007, 8, 9 and just explain the context that existed then with respect to the international policy arena, the motivations for why New Zealand took this step to create something like the GRA, and then just show some of the activities that have been undertaken, New Zealand's role in that, and the sort of reach and connections that we've been able to establish internationally as a consequence. So first, the kind of theoretical basis. We have a scientific audience. So just in terms of science diplomacy, and we heard this mentioned yesterday, I think James Palmer mentioned it around science diplomacy, and I quickly jumped in defence of public officials at the time. But I guess science diplomacy had been described in terms of, the what you do. So, providing advice to inform policy objectives, diplomacy for science, facilitating international cooperation, science for diplomacy, cooperation, improving international relations. More recently, the former chief scientist, the Prime Minister, Sir Peter Gluckman, and colleagues kind of rephrased that in what they called a more pragmatic framing of science diplomacy, which to me is more of the why you do things. And so they characterised science diplomacy in three broad ways. First of all, direct national interest, the idea of cross-border interests, and then meeting global needs and challenges, and of course climate change is certainly one of those. So with that kind of introduction, I mean, to me the GRA is it is a science diplomacy initiative, and it is one where the direct national interest of a country aligned with the other cross-border and global interests in terms of addressing climate change. The launch of the GRA was in 2009, and that was having already begun to create international collaboration through LEARN, as we called it, the Livestock Emissions Abatement Research Network, which was very much a bottom-up scientific network of scientists focusing on livestock greenhouse gases. And on the basis of that experience, the GRA was promoted, which combined the bottom-up nature of LEARN as it was and a top-down intergovernmental characteristic. And it's important to remember that in 2009, New Zealand's circumstances were different to other countries, and I'll explain in a moment. We said a lot, New Zealand's unique, and we've kind of changed the message now. But in those days, we kind of were, and I'll go into that soon. And also, at the time, the then chief scientist of the UK, I'm not sure if he's Sir or not, but anyway, John Beddington, talked about a perfect storm of global events, and this was this link between addressing climate change, food insecurity, development, etc. And this was on the back of, amongst other things, the global food crisis, as it was called at the time. So the sort of convergence of events and circumstances all around the 2008 to 2009 period, which meant that the GRA was sort of an idea whose time had come. If we look at the world, and this basically is to show magnitude of emissions, so the darker the colour, the more the emissions. The date doesn't matter, things haven't changed that much. These are the largest emitters. So this is agricultural greenhouse gases, namely methane, nitrous oxide from the direct production of food, basically. So what you see there is there are some very big emitters, and what you might also recognise, at least if you were involved in those discussions at the time, is that a good proportion of those countries weren't really subject to binding targets under the then Kyoto Protocol. And if we look also at percentage of emissions in the national economy, we see kind of some convergence and a lot of difference. I'm sort of going to cycle between the two. So when you look at the percentage of national total, you have a different group of countries largely. Now the issue is that for those countries where agriculture was a significant proportion of national total, a number of things existed. One, they weren't subject to commitments under the Kyoto Protocol because they were largely developing countries. And two, the capability and capacity to actually address this wasn't particularly strong in many of those countries. When you look at countries where agriculture is a very significant contributor, so namely United States, Australia, Canada to some extent, Western Europe, you have a situation where, as a proportion of national total, it's not on the political agenda, right? You're talking in the US maybe around 4% of total. I think Canada's about 10% of total. Western Europe probably hovering around 10% on average, but in some cases slightly higher. So you kind of have a situation where New Zealand, with 50% of its total, with a target as a developed country, found itself a little bit alone. And that was a very strong motivation to look for friends and try and align our interests with the global interest and catalyse action. So, this led us to the Copenhagen Climate Conference, 2009, where the GRA was launched. So this was a group of approximately 22 or 3 countries, joined a ministerial statement to set a vision for what we wanted to try and establish. I just show on the right-hand side, for some of you will recognise some of these logos. These are other sort of global or regional research and climate type collaborations. Most of them came slightly after the GRA, so we're sort of the first of its kind, but very quickly afterwards we saw a global mobilisation to address this issue, largely brought about by the circumstances I described earlier around the kind of perfect storm, as John Beddington described it. And so we launched the GRA, and this is kind of what it looked like at the beginning, and as we went through the years, we see membership growing. We see relatively good participation from most regions in the world, but we see a big gap there in the continent of Africa, which we're pleased to say in recent years has really changed. So let's go to the next slide. It's not moving. There we go. So this is the current day, and we in the GRA recognise that we really couldn't have a situation where Africa and other significant developing countries weren't at the table, and part of the way to encourage countries to join was to slightly shift the narrative. So in the early outset of the GRA, there was a very clear separation of the science from the policy to not get involved in the climate negotiations, which wouldn't have been particularly helpful, and a very strong focus on mitigation, because unlike, as we discussed yesterday, where in New Zealand it had all been about mitigation, internationally it's basically all about adaptation, and it was very difficult to have a conversation on mitigation for lots of good reasons. Recognising the need to bring developing countries on board, we shifted the narrative a wee bit to really, I guess, expand the focus of GRA so that it wasn't just about the direct mitigation technology, the sort of work we do in New Zealand, but also trying to demonstrate that through improved animal husbandry, animal health, increasing levels of productivity, whether it be animal or crop production, developing countries were already making contributions to reduce emissions per unit product, and could do a lot more. And in those sorts of actions, it would align with their direct national interests, i.e. improving livelihoods, food security. And so this helped really to bring on more countries. The other dimension, and I don't want to go through the sort of boring details of how the GRA operates, but basically you have a council and research groups, and you have a rotating leadership of the GRA council, and you have groups of countries that take on the lead of different research areas. My main point here is to say that the countries coloured in red are those countries which have at some point or still lead different aspects of the GRA. So what we see is pretty good global coverage of our membership, but also a good number of countries that have actually committed to lead in certain areas. And if we look at the current day, this is the situation. So our current chair is Germany, and Indonesia will be taking on the chair of the GRA from October this year. And then we have groups of countries focusing on livestock, rice, croplands, and what we call integrative research group, which is basically the sort of cross-cutting issues like soil carbon measurement. And I'll let you geographers work out which countries are which. In terms of the kind of things the GRA does, and now there's an enormous amount of work, and this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just to give you a flavour of the different sorts of activities that have been promoted through the GRA. And when I say, what the GRA does, it's really what its members and partners do, having utilised the GRA as a forum to promote collaboration. So one, to my mind, probably one of the best examples of global collaboration in this area is this global rumen census that was conducted, driven by New Zealand, but with the participation of many scientists from many countries, really to try and understand, you know, the environment inside the animal that we were trying to manipulate, develop vaccines, chemical inhibitors, feed additives, whatever, to try and understand how different that environment is in different animals in different parts of the world. And it was only because of this global scale collaboration with the kind of data that could be brought together that we were able to come to some conclusion, which is that the rumen microbes aren't so different internationally. So it gives confidence to investment in quite expensive research programs. That, you know, potentially there could be a technology out there that could have relatively broad applicability. So similar sorts of work, you know, aggregating data, undertaking meta-analysis to try and draw more robust conclusions. This is a network established under the Croplands group of the GRA, and you can see the number of data sets and number of countries that have been involved in contributing, and this continues and has calls for data all the time to improve the scope and coverage of its work. We've worked with the scientific community and also the food and beverage sector, basically. This initiative called the SAI platform, which has sort of 80 or 90 different major companies, to try and translate, well, not translate, basically say what we know today about best practice, i.e. those things that are ready to be adopted, the kind of potential they offer for reducing emissions, what some of the trade-offs or co-benefits might be, and then also stepping back into the line, you know, towards the sort of pilot discovery and proof of concept phase to sort of say, you know, what are the different states of knowledge and how far away are they from potentially being available for farmers. And so the good thing about this study is it really, you know, brought together all of the knowledge we had, but also had the buy-in from the livestock industry. And so this is just some of the examples of the kind of material provided. It's been produced in Spanish, English, and French, so it has more relevance. Another example, this is to try and bring together all available knowledge and experiences of different countries and how they've quantified greenhouse gases from agriculture, which remains a significant challenge for pretty much most countries. And so this is a platform that is supported by the GRA and one of our partner organisations, and this will be used more and more as countries start to develop and elaborate their commitments under the Paris Agreement, where quantification of mitigation is fundamentally important. Another activity that New Zealand has been very important in driving is this sort of farmer-to-farmer, but also science-to-farmer networks. So for a number of years we've run an annual study tour where sometimes young, sometimes not so young, farmers are brought together from different countries, normally around a week together in different countries, but every second year in New Zealand, just to, I mean, talk about the science, the issues around greenhouse gases and mitigation, but also see farms and see how different farmers in different parts of the world are approaching the issue or not, understanding the different political contexts, environmental contexts, what are the challenges facing those different farmers, and, you know, maybe each one takes something from that and thinks about how that, you know, relates to their own business, and this will be something we continue to do over a number of years, and it's been very, very popular. Capability building. Some will recognise these logos. There are probably people in the room that are recipients of these awards. There's a Cliff Grads, we call it, PhD scholarship program, where the GRA and the climate change program of the CGIR have jointly run a call for PhD students in developing countries, funded by MPI and by the US Department, or Agency rather, for International Development. And we've already awarded 42 scholarships over the last year and a half. And there'll be another call coming this year. So this is basically a sort of a 6-month stay within a research organisation somewhere in the world to increase skill and technical knowledge as part of a student's PhD experience. And then we have our Learn fellowship program. Learn, having been the precursor to the GRA, now focused on capability, and we offer a number of different awards. Many of you have probably also received them, and you can see quite a significant number. So with these activities and many, many others that I haven't mentioned, you know, what has it meant for New Zealand's insertion internationally? So if we look at recipients of New Zealand funded awards, workshops or study tours, so everything pulled together, these are the country of origin of those recipients. So we cover pretty much the planet. If you look at our research collaborations through targeted funding, through GPLER, if you probably some of you know the acronyms, some of the European funding calls that we've participated in because of our ability to fund those projects internationally. This is the kind of connection we have in the research, right? So the previous slide is New Zealand's capability building outreach, and this is really research of direct interest to New Zealand that we are involved in with these countries. So again, a very diverse group of countries, and really, really important for New Zealand to have those connections. Quickly to talk about, is that 5? Yeah. Benefits. So, you know, as I said earlier, this is a science diplomacy initiative. So, you know, you shouldn't underestimate the benefit of being visible, and through visibility, generating and having influence over others. These are our partner organisations here on the left-hand side. Some will recognise these logos, but simply put, you have a collection of different types of organisations. You have development banks, you have research providers, you have farmer organisations, agribusiness, you have other similar initiatives working, let's say, not globally but regionally, or more broadly than just mitigation. And with each one of these partner organisations, we have different sorts of activities. And just to think of a few things, so how have we influenced Fontagro? Fontagro is a fund in Latin America, 15 member countries. Because of the GRA and New Zealand's involvement, the first call of its funding programs on livestock and mitigation happened in about 2010. It would never have happened without our participation and sort of pushing that region to get more engaged in this scientific area. Through CCAC and the involvement of New Zealand, led now by Victoria Hatton, who's here, we've leveraged significant funding from the CCAC to support GRA activities with FAO and with the centre, with Harry and the team. We're currently in conversations with the World Bank because they're getting interested in low emissions animals, and this is New Zealand's one of the main research programs. So there's potential for the bank to mobilise potentially quite significant resources to support more global research on that area. With the, CGIR, so this is 15 centres all around the world, and also a climate change program. We have a very strong partnership, and in fact last year the Minister attended. We had a conference in Berlin. This was the first global conference on mitigation on agriculture specifically. Normally the mitigation part's kind of the poor cousin to adaptation and food security, but we said no, we have to bring everyone together that we can and talk about mitigation, because we need to advance the agenda. And then I guess more recently, not so much partners, but the G20. New Zealand claimers knocks on the door, can we please be part of the G20? And we're a long way from being a G20 country, but GRA has been invited to the G20 Agriculture Chief Scientist meeting 3 years in a row, because it's a big platform and it's seen as a leader in this area. And of course that's in a way New Zealand in the room as well. Other benefits, leveraging investment and expertise. If we look at our research expenditure as New Zealand, we've leveraged almost $2 for every $1 we've spent in research. And that's over that 10-year period, which was for the first years getting set up. And if I look at examples and the more recent examples, we're leveraging maybe $7 to every one we spend. So I expect that ratio to change significantly in the future. And I won't read these, but these are sort of anecdotes from a review of the GRA that we undertook last year, and some of the comments of the New Zealand science community of the benefits of having that GRA network and what that allowed them to leverage from others, and the contributions that were made from other very significant and well-funded entities that had New Zealand tried to purchase those services commercially, it would have cost millions, but it was just put on the table free. It was a contribution, so it's having great benefit in lots of different ways. I think the other point to note is the GRA has enjoyed a sort of bipartisanship, and the Royal Society talks about scientific values of rationality, transparency and universality are the same the world over, and they can help to underpin good governance and build trust, the honest broker of science. And we have seen over the 10 years of the GRA that our friends in Canada, the United States, here, many countries have seen changes in government. In some cases, in our nearest neighbours, many changes in government. But the commitment to the GRA, I would say, has probably grown despite that. Even if you think, goodness me, in some situations, clearly they'll be doing nothing on climate change. Well, no, that's not the case. Some countries have actually increased their involvement. So I think it's operated at a level that's visible but not quite too visible. It's strongly scientific and not so political. Just struck a balance. So It's been able to enjoy support from all governments of all persuasions in all of our member countries, which is a really important thing for that long-term sustained investment. However, just quickly to finalise, we're not on track as a planet. This shows you some modelling that was done in terms of what agriculture, should is this working? Yeah, should contribute to be in line with the 2-degree target of the Paris Agreement. So basically, this is your sort of business as usual. This is what agriculture should be doing, and there's a kind of gigaton gap by 2030, which is quite a lot. And this gigaton gap is calculated from a range of different models, and they kind of coincide around a gigaton. When you look at current knowledge at reasonable cost, you're looking at this kind of potential. So we're kind of missing a lot of mitigation there, and we can't just rely on the scaling up of best practice. We need new technology, new practices, and we need cheaper options so that farmers will adopt these. The IPCC 1.5 report was mentioned yesterday as well. It's showing, well, a different thing, but basically, although agriculture is not expected to go to zero as other sectors are, it still has to make quite significant reductions, as you can see here. So we're talking agricultural methane 2030 relative to 2010, this kind of reduction, in 2050, this kind of reduction, and likewise for nitrous oxide. So there's a way to go. The challenges are, of course, that climate change will impact agriculture severely, and this is likely to make mitigation even more difficult. It'll make it harder to keep soil and carbon in the ground, which is largely driven by precipitation and temperature. It will probably reduce the quality of animal diets, although we saw the projections yesterday to say there's more dry matter production with CO2 fertilisation. One would consider the quality of that dry matter probably not being improved. We've seen already the projections of reduced rates of productivity increase, and in many cases reduced yields in absolute terms in some of those most vulnerable regions. I want to really stress the importance of quantification. It sounds kind of sciencey and all the rest of it, and things that Joel does every year in compiling the inventory, but this is a massive problem. Work we've done through the GRA shows that 5 out of 140 developing countries today can routinely capture livestock greenhouse gases in their inventory, i.e. updating emissions factors linked to what's happening on the ground. That's in developing countries. But it's not only a problem or challenge of developing countries. Some work was done in the EU looking at the kind of practices being promoted through the Common Agricultural Policy and the extent to which the inventories in the EU could capture that. 5 out of 22 practices could be captured today in those inventories. So we have a way to go. And there's also a disconnect between industry code of practice, good practice, and public policy. If we hear a lot about the 4 Rs, the sort of nutrient stewardship, the right source, the right rate, the right time, the right place. This is a kind of a pet peeve of mine, but how do you possibly capture good 4R practice when inventories are not necessarily spatially explicit, when we use a constant emissions factor, which basically links to emissions times quantity of nitrogen? There's no discrimination between what type of nitrogen it was, the rate at which it was applied, or seasonality. Yet this is the best practice being promoted internationally. And this is my final slide. We have a dearth of capability and capacity in the world, and I think acute in some regions of the world. And we definitely and desperately need to develop the pipeline of new science leaders. And we're beginning to look at master's level through the GRA. We've done some work in postdoc and PhD, as you've seen, but we're going right back to masters now, and we're trying to bring through people. It's very, very challenging to have truly international collaboration. National science systems take a lot of time to move around. They work on multi-year budget cycles. There's, in situations where resources are scarce, there's more competition than collaboration. And it's typically nationalistic. There are very few examples of truly international funding for this topic. It is basically national budgets for national scientists. And there's probably New Zealand as a standout on this, where we have actually had money for international collaboration, not just for the New Zealand program. So we need sustained, we need long-term investment in science. And this sends really important signals. It's about retaining expertise of our science community, not just here, but globally. It gives confidence to the investment in the infrastructure we know we need to scale up and accelerate our efforts. It needs to be proportional to the scale of the challenge as I presented. We're not on track to achieve the targets we're setting. And the funding, as much as the quantum, it needs to be flexible to enable maximum agility in this international landscape, which is just difficult to address. And I think the final point I'd make, as you've hopefully seen, that the things we do really matter and they make a difference. Thank you.